Hello class, so now I'm recording a screencast on how it is that we're understanding the basics of an argument, and then I'll evaluate an argument to help illustrate how we're understanding what an argument is. So finding a logical argument. So one goal in the study of philosophy is to teach us to identify basic lines of argumentation. In its most elemental form, an argument contains premises, claims, and evidence, which lead up to and provide support for conclusions. So these elements are not always easily identifiable, but that's your job as an inquisitive philosopher to disentangle lines of thought, lines of argumentation, essentially. So, in other words, a basic argument contains premises and a conclusion. Okay. So, in other words, the claims and evidence are other words for the premises, and the conclusions are the inference that is made by way of the premises. What the evidence or claims lead to, right? What conclusions those are. So you will attempt to pull out an argument from the arguments found in text or ethical, philosophical idea selected, or even your own writing. So this exercise should serve as to aid you in determining and outlining philosophical ethical arguments you have selected for your essays and elsewhere. Okay, so this is really just a primer on how it is that we're understanding what an argument is, and basically the essentials of how to think about argumentation, and then also how to do that, how to pull out an argument, how to evaluate an argument. So first, we need to know types of arguments. Now, these aren't the only types of arguments there are, but they're the main ways in which we start to look at what an argument is. So first, we have a deductive argument. So the premises of a deductive argument prove or support its conclusion if in every possible situation in which the premises are true, the conclusion also must be true. Okay? So a deductive argument is valid when in every possible situation in which the premises are true, its conclusion also must be true. So the premises and conclusion of a valid argument do not have to be true. In other words, the basic structure of the argument, uh, only helps to make an argument valid. Okay. So then, if a deductive argument is not valid, then the argument is not sound. An argument that is both valid and has true premises is known as a sound argument. So really, in order for the argument to be good, it needs to be both valid and sound, okay? And remember that the conditions for this line of argumentation are more stringent than with an inductive argument, since an inductive argument is only an argument for what is probable. A deductive argument usually is logically organized from the general to the specific. In other words, there's a line of reasoning that's considering general cases as they apply to a specific example. Okay? So you're going from a broad general way of thinking to a specific individual way of thinking there in terms of that argumentation. Okay, so then we have an inductive argument. So an inductive argument is a probable argument whose premises are claims about what is true in some cases, not all cases, as would be the case in a deductive argument. So the conclusion of an inductive argument is a claim about what will be true in similar cases. Okay, so an inductive argument is a strong argument if its premises make the conclusion very probable. and it is a weak argument if they do not. An inductive argument usually argues from the specific, a sample, to a general, to the general population of whatever it is you're taking into consideration. So in other words, induction is also another word for conclusion, but it has more specific technical language whereby if we're drawing inductive arguments, we're thinking of the way in which we're moving from a specific example to then draw a general conclusion. Okay. And this is usually the way in which scientific thinking is understood, that if we understand specific instances of phenomena, we could usually draw a conclusion that anything that's like that specific instance of phenomena is probably true generally. Probably true generally. Okay, so that's an inductive argument, more or less. Then we have an abductive argument. So this doesn't have to do with abduction, but the word that what we're thinking of is an abductive argument is a way of referring to an argument from best explanation. In other words, this is another way that this type of argument is known as an argument from best explanation, or to best explanation is sometimes how it's worded. This type of argument is identified as a way to draw a conclusion without all the information included in the premises. So, in other words, an abductive argument is made even when there is not 100% certainty of the premises. Now, in a way, this sounds like a weaker argument, but all we're really, you'd be surprised at how many ways in which we think about the world whereby we don't have 100% certainty of the premises. It's amazing. And so probably like a good example of that would be the way we're thinking of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So the idea of natural selection, according to Charles Darwin, has conclusions about the origin of human beings, for example, that we cannot actually go and find. So the information that is used to draw the conclusion is not 100% available. Okay, so that's a fascinating type of argument to consider. And so remember that a deductive argument is always, it needs to be always the case. An inductive argument is probably the case. An abductive argument is argument whereby we don't have all the information, but we're still drawing a conclusion. Okay. Now, we want to then pull out, identify, and evaluate an argument. So here we want to read what we're evaluating, or using your own writing, and taking that into consideration. So when we do that, we're asking ourselves while we're reading it, is there a conclusion? If so, what is it? In other words, what's at stake? What is the direction of the main argument? What is the thesis? So sometimes when we're asked, what is the conclusion? A good way of thinking about this is, what is the thesis? What's the overall point? So what I tell students is that the easiest way to pull out an argument is to consider the conclusion first. Okay. So then what you want to do after you've done that is, can the supporting statements, i.e. the premises, be stated in one or two sentences? So can you now isolate the evidence provided? How did we get to this conclusion? How did we get to this inference? How did we get to this deduction, right? So is there more than one element to consider? Does this set of elements contribute? Do they support the conclusion? Contribute or support the conclusion without too many problems? Do the claims present any logical fallacies? So in other words, the way to know if the argument is strong is to start examining the premises and take it from there. Okay. So, considering the way in which the premises are laid out, you would start applying critical thinking to how that's understood. So now we'll evaluate a basic argument. So now I'll evaluate a formal argument excerpted from Rosalind Hirsthouse's essay, Environmental Virtue Ethics. So I've located a single paragraph from Rosalind Hirsthouse's essay, Environmental Virtue Ethics. So be sure to consider that I'm only using this short paragraph as a compact illustration and time-saving example. We could look at her whole essay and try to formulate one argument from there, but this is easier for us to examine. So, and then also we need to know for background, she's referencing this so-called green belief, which basically entails that a radical change in which we ethically and morally engage with nature is crucial for her. So Rosalind Hirsthouse is a virtue ethicist, obviously, and she's writing about the environment and really coming up with this idea that we need another way to engage with nature virtuously, and that's what she's working to do here. So let's read this. So it can be seen that defending the green belief in terms of old virtues and vices involves a particular strategy. So each old virtue or vice mentioned is considered in the context of a new area of our relations with nature, and thereby acquires a new application or dimension. I have briefly alluded to the old virtues of prudence, practical wisdom, compassion, and proper humility, and the old vices of greed, self-indulgence, short-sightedness, cruelty, pride, vanity, dishonesty, and arrogance. We acquire a new perception or understanding of what is involved in being compassionate or greedy or short-sighted or properly humble or arrogant. Some of the old virtues and vices get reconfigured. So, and we might well say from the virtue ethics standpoint, this has been a standard strategy for ethical advance. So we note a parallel strategy in much deontological environmental ethics. You take a familiar old moral rule or duty, such as the duty to not kill or to harm, and you play it out on a different stage, thereby giving it a new interpretation. So in other words, she's developing a way in which to lay out a new virtue in terms of the way we understand nature. So what I did was I looked at this paragraph here and I thought, well, what's the conclusion? So for Hirsthouse, virtue ethics serves as an ethical guide in theory through our ever-changing and developing ethical attitude and action with respect to the environment. So this is best accomplished once we identify how the green belief conjoins with specific vices in relation with the identification of new virtues. So in order to understand new virtues, we need to understand what vices are. We also need to understand that there could be a development in terms of the way that we understand virtue, and that's what she's working on, is establishing a new virtue in terms of how we understand the environment. Okay, and then so once I established what that is, what her conclusion is, I've worked on the premises. How did she get here? Okay, so premise one. Given that Hirsthouse's recognition of a developing ever new relationship with nature combined with the so-called green belief, we need to reevaluate our ethical stance in order to establish what that virtue is. In other words, okay? So premise two, this ethical stance needs to be recognized in terms of distinct and easily identifiable virtues, i.e. humility, and vices in terms of arrogance. In short, virtue ethics will help get us there. And we drew our conclusion from there. And so there's some other points here on deontology that we don't, in the parentheses, that we're not using. So why don't we take it from there and talk more about this in class? Thank you.